What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today, Bryan and myself are going to have a larger discussion around what it takes to go from the intermediate level phase into advanced. This was a question Bryan got posed to him on Instagram that we thought would be fantastic to turn just into a larger conversation on the podcast because it's a very interesting question. And Bryan and I have a bunch of different thoughts down that we're excited to jump into. But before we get into these, Bryan, what is going on, my man?
I'm fresh back from Newport Beach. Had a wonderful 3 days there with Lori and Laura, my ladies of Paragon. We just call them L squared now for short because it's much easier. And the seminar smashed. It was so rad. We ended up only with 11 people instead of initially we put it out to 20, but it was way better with 11 for it being our first time and like going through structures and organizing everything. And then we had this big plan that we were going to have like 45 minutes of Q&A in the beginning and then jump into kind of like movement explanation and demos like we did at N1, where Cass would walk around and he would talk about movements for a little bit, tell you the things that the points of performance to focus on. And then you'd have, 20 minutes to work up to a heavy set or whatever. So we kind of did the same thing. But we realized very quickly that our 45-minute window we created for Q&A was way too short, not going to work. And so instead of just having people sit there for like 2 or 3 hours doing Q&A, we figure we do 3 questions, then we jump up and do like an hour of movement demos and execution stuff. People would get to work out, move a little bit. Then we jump back to another 3 or 4 questions for Q&A and then back to movement demos and stuff like that. So it was a perfect flow where people, never got tired of sitting or never got too tired of training. And it just kind of went really well. I think everyone got a lot out of it. And for the future, I think we're going to try and do one around my area, around Denver, Boulder area. We're going to try and do one in DC, one in Dallas. And we're looking for a few other locations too. If anyone wants us to come, let us know if there's a good gym that has both commercial gym machine equipment, but also has like a good space where we can do this thing where there's like free weights and stuff like that too. So yeah, that would be cool future plans for us. Regarding how did my diet go over this weekend? It was the first time in my diet where I had a 3-day period where I couldn't weigh. So I was basically tracking my food as I usually would and moving a lot. I had each day I was there was somewhere between 16 and 22,000 steps. So I knew I was moving a ton. And I didn't actually exceed my calorie number. I was within the 26 to 3,100 range every day. So, of course I get home from the trip and I'm expecting this like big drop in the scale with all these steps and the lower calories and all these things, get home and the scale literally hasn't moved for like a week. So, I'm like 190.6 now, which is a pound above my lowest low for the diet. So, instead of stressing about it, I think very obviously that the answer here is that I did a whole ton of steps. I was stressed out from not stressed out, but my body was stressed out. It was inflamed from a 7-hour seminar on lifting, all the steps, all the travel, being on an airplane yesterday, all this stuff. So I confidently am moving forward with the idea that I'm still on track. And I think in the next couple days, we should see a drop in weight there. And then let's jump over to you real quick before my last update. What's going on with you?
I mean, my big update is in, 9 days. Whatever, next Thursday, it's Tuesday right now. We will leave the country for the next 5+ months. So trying to get everything done, planning for what I need, what I don't need, is just the big news. I'm very, very excited. I'm excited to get back to like some of the adventure part of life. That was the whole reason we kind of, started. It's been a lot of work, which obviously I've really grown to love, but I am a little bit of adventure on the side too. So I'm super, super excited for that. And then my other big update is taking on clients, right? So I have a new kind of pilot that I'm running. So I'm only going to take like six people, and I already have one. And it is basically like a coaching capability container. So I've spoken about this. I sent an email out. There's a lot of people selling a lot of like front end sales leads and stuff. But what I've really seen, and when I've talked to people who've gone through things like I have, there's really big drops on service fulfillment, which is really the only thing that matters at the end of the day. So because of my background and things, like I've just hand built a lot of things that I use to run Straker Nutrition Company. And then I give all these tools to you, right? And then help you bridge the gap of education you may have and confidence in your coaching capabilities. And then I am still doing all of your nutrition coaching on top of it. So I'm big on leading from the front, right? Being a product of your product. And then we use education through experience as another format of facilitating education. So if you are a male interested in that, just reach out to me, DM me. My email is in the show notes, I believe, or you can find it very easily on my website, and we will go from there. But those are the two big updates from me, and I do not have a back update. I'm sick of talking about it. I'm just putting it out there that it's going to be back to normal, and I'm never going to talk about it again. So I'm sticking to it.
All right. Do you know how long you're staying in Bali this time?
We will be there from like May 10th or 8th or something like that through the end of September.
5 months or so.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. Very nice. Cool. Well, my last update is on training. I mentioned on the last episode that I was finally out of systemic metabolic and moving into local metabolic. So I have done that. I am now 3 sessions in to my 8 sessions of local metabolic. And it's been significantly easier and less demanding than systemic. I mean, it was like I was saying last time on the last episode, I used the analogy of suffocating my system, like just me suffocating versus like suffocating one muscle. And that's kind of exactly how it feels, because even though I can finish like a 6x8 sequence with 30-second rest between sets, and my quads are like literally like unable to walk. They're like oscillating with blood flow in them, and it's so painful, right? I feel fine. Like, it's just my quads. It's obviously, if I just woke up one morning and my quads were like that, I'd be like, what the fuck is happening? But like in the context of having done a 6x8, it's exactly what you should feel. And within 3 minutes, I'm moving on to the next movement and kind of going through the same thing there. So it's very acutely painful, but finishing the session and feeling great. And then one of the things I did on my second metabolic day, so I have 4 sessions over the course of an 8-day period. 2 of them are 6x8s. And 2 of them are same muscle group supersets. And this is kind of my hack to get away from having to do 15 to 20 rep sets, where I feel like the first 10 reps don't provide a ton of value. So same muscle group supersets for me are 2 sets of 6 to 10 back to back. And I really feel like it's probably not an exact equivalent, but doing 2 supersets of going from like hack squat to leg extension, and then again, hack squat to leg extension, you're getting 4 fatigue points there. So I would put that relatively akin to doing like 4 sets of 15 to 20 reps, where you get 4 fatigue points too. So for me, it's a little more enjoyable, a little more time efficient, and I think slightly more productive. So that's my second day. And I did the first one of those yesterday, and I really enjoyed that too. So local training's been cool, but one of the kind of epiphanies I had, and epiphany is probably too strong of a word, but one thing I noticed as I was going through my iliac lat pull downs, my prone chest supported pull downs yesterday, was that it was San Diego. It was before I started the metabolic cycle, was the last time that I did any like partials or reverse drop sets or anything like that. And it kind of came to the front of my brain because I was showing on my story how the first rep of a prone iliac pull down moves so quickly, the second rep quickly, third rep quickly, and then I skipped to the last 2 reps. And the last 2 reps, it moves quickly in like the first 2/3 of the movement. And then the last third, it's like 6 seconds to get from like midway through the rep to contraction point. And it just reminded me how productive I felt like those partials were. Like really, because there is just so little tension, even at the end of a set, when you're dead tired and you're struggling to even complete a rep, you can still get through that first portion of the rep so quickly and effortlessly. That it just, got me excited again to start reintroducing some of those techniques, throwing some reverse drop sets, and follow kind of some of that progression model that I've been using throughout the last year or so.
Yeah, I think I mean, it kind of is good, perfect segue into the conversation we're having today, right? Because there's people that say like, oh, like partial reps don't count, right? There's that big joke with like the, Dr. Mike and Charlie and Jared and stuff, but I mean, I guess they kind of don't count. Do they not have any effectiveness at all? I wouldn't agree with that whatsoever. I feel confident you would say the same. There's a time and a place for a lot of things, but as always, like context is important and how much do you need them, really?
Yeah, it's actually interesting too, just thinking about this since you said that, because yeah, Dr. Mike and those guys are all like full range of motion, everything type thing, but they're also like specifically Dr. Mike is like super on the lengthened overload train these days. Like everything he talks about is like the importance of lengthened overload, achieving the stretch and all of that stuff. So, it's interesting. Wouldn't it be funny one day if we see Dr. Mike actually doing partials in his like accumulation, his final week before deload? Like, yep, just overloading the lengthen position. I feel like that's inevitable one of these days.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah. But jumping into this conversation here, going from intermediate to advanced, it's very interesting to me, and I think it's super applicable. And there's lessons from here because I have kind of had two journeys from intermediate to advanced. And it's so weird to look at the dichotomy between the different ways in which both of those journeys went, right? So I have journey number one that took place in, we could probably call it from like my 9 years into training point, where I was graduated college. I was as strong as I've ever been, basically, when I look back at my numbers. And I had about 3 or 4 years of training before I jumped into CrossFit. So I really think that journey kind of to the end of college into like the early corporate days in my early 20s was kind of my journey from intermediate to advanced. But then I stopped doing hypertrophy training, honestly, partially out of frustration. Like, yes, CrossFit was there, but I didn't have the tools that first time around to make a really great leap from intermediate to advanced, or at least to continue progressing once I became advanced. Maybe I made the leap to advanced, but then I kind of got stuck there. And then so I just kind of jumped into CrossFit. It was something different, and it allowed me to, I guess, experience another intermediate to advanced, which I didn't even think about. That's kind of like 3 of them now, because then I came out of CrossFit and came back into hypertrophy, but I felt like going from intermediate to advanced again because I hadn't done any hypertrophy work as like a sole focus for so long. And there were all these tools and all of these things. And there was research-based, evidence-based. There were things that you could actually learn from others and people that have gone through this that have more education than I did. And my last time going through it, it was a hodgepodge of a bunch of different routines from muscle magazines and forums and things like that. So I want to certainly get into all the specifics of kind of what I learned at each stage and stuff like that. But I just thought that was a really interesting kind of jumping off point to look at my journey that way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in that, what's really interesting is if you were to Google this topic, right, there's going to be, people are going to define it all sorts of different ways. And one thing that I always find interesting is people say like, oh, after like 2 years of training, you're like advanced. And I guess it depends. Like let's say you're, 18 years old, Bryan, you walk into like a mecca of bodybuilding gym somewhere. Like I think you could go pretty far in 2 years with the right kind of tutelage and information and stuff. But I think that's a very small, limited, context. Most of us get into it. We bounce around with some kind of shit information handed down from like the old heads in your, traditional gym. And the same thing with me. Like I kind of, by the time I entered doing CrossFit, right, I was 22 years old. I'd been training 4 or 5 days a week consistently for 7 years now at that point. But I wouldn't really consider myself advanced. And it was mostly from a physical standpoint, right? The mental, questions around training and context and application and stuff weren't there. It was just like, oh, I go train, and I was like that at that point, I was into like weight training. There wasn't much of a difference between like strength training and hypertrophy to me. It was more of just like the weight room style training, where obviously, like you're not going to do a bench press for 20 reps. So like arms are higher repetition, but like you don't really know why. It's just like, oh, it's just this thing you do, So that was for me. And then, entering CrossFit, obviously everyone comes into CrossFit, ground level, and you're just getting your dick pushed in every day. But then after that, when I transitioned back, I was still kind of in that like strength training, thing where I had a hard time letting go of the fact that I needed to be like really strong. So when I got into like hypertrophy, I was very much so intermediate still, I would consider, even though I was training at this point for like 14 years. And then once I was really into like hypertrophy, and then kind of what I'm going to get into talking more around, it was the more psychological and mental aspect around training of where I've come into feeling rather confident I am advanced now. So yeah, very similar trajectory with kind of blurring that line for a while as you fall in and out of different modalities based on interests and the education around.
Yeah, and how much education exists now that didn't exist back then. I mean, that's a huge piece. It probably would be useful to put some sort of model together of what a beginner, intermediate, and advanced is, because you alluded to like some models have it as advanced at 2 years. And so I've seen that model, which is ridiculous, where it's basically like 0 to 6 months beginner, 6 months to 2 years intermediate, and then 2 years plus advanced. I think that you can look at it a little bit better than that, focus a little bit more, and look at the rate of progression. So if a beginner is defined as like every session you go into the gym and you can add something because the neural adaptations are just so fast. So maybe that is 6 months, maybe that's a year. It could be a little more. I think a lot of it depends on how committed you are during that time as well. But you do jump out of beginner stage really quickly. And then I think the intermediate stage is way, way longer. Like to say intermediate would be 1.5 years is ridiculous to me. I kind of think like it's 5+ years or 3 to 5 years or something along those lines, depending on the person. I mean, maybe in that perfect like utopian world that you mentioned, where I go into the gym with like Cass in year 1, and he's like, I'm going to take you under my wing and we're going to talk about your food and your training, and you're just going to have me running all your shit. Then maybe 2 years in, I'm like, okay, I'm advanced, maybe. But I think that also part of being advanced is a certain level of experience that you just can't get no matter how strong you are. So in that case, when you look at progression, going back to my initial idea here, beginners can add weight to the bar almost consistently every session. Intermediates are probably adding weight to the bar every mesocycle. So that would be every like 4 to 6 weeks. And I think the RP model actually does a really good job of that, where, you start at 3 to 4 RIR, you build up, you test at the end of a mesocycle, and then you deload and recycle and repeat type thing. So you can compare like 6 weeks prior to 6 weeks in the future and see whether that progression is occurring mesocycle to mesocycle. And then for advanced, I think, I don't know that you can even be considered advanced if you're adding weight to the bar every month. I think that that's like too fast of a rate. If you're advanced, you're maybe adding 5 or 10 pounds to the bar a year. Which means that a lot of these things that we're going to talk about need to become more important than just adding weight to the bar to define your success, right? So kind of using my story as an example again to kind of jump back, in that first period in 2006 where I was like finishing college, jumping into the corporate world, I had been training, oscillating for a few years between basically 2 programs that had the exact same split. So there was Max OT, which is straight sets of like 4 to 8 reps. So super low reps, very concentrated. And there was pyramid style, which I now kind of talk about. I don't exactly like, but it's like, a 12-10-8-6 or a 10-8-6-4 type thing where you're increasing weight each set. And I always used this exact split where I did chest on Mondays, back on Tuesdays, legs on Wednesdays, shoulders and abs on Thursdays, and arms on Fridays. And then I would take the weekend off. And so that was just the split. And no matter what my rep scheme approach was, whether it was the 4x8 from Max OT or it was the pyramid style, I would literally go like one of those programs until I got bored of it and stopped making progress. or got injured or whatever. And then I would switch to the other one, and keeping the exact same split and mostly the exact same exercise selection, I would just change my rep scheme and do the pyramid style. And so I didn't have the tools or even the knowledge to change that up, because like in my mind, I was staying within the realm of what was comfortable for me, because I like this split. Like I like knowing that on Mondays I do chest and on Tuesdays I do back, and like I don't have to think about it, and it's almost just like background noise. So part of maybe going from intermediate to advanced is balancing being in your comfort zone and knowing what works for you, but also experimenting with intelligent additions, exploring new possible ways that maybe are better than what you did. What do you think about that?
I think if I had to sum up what I think into advanced is, it's going to be more mental than physical. Um, because I personally believe that you can probably get to like a pretty damn decent physique with still being intermediate without ever having to go into these, the more mental aspect of it. But it's like thinking at a different level and exploring things. Like it's in that, like the exploration requires you to understand like the training and the different parts of it at a deeper level to even desire that exploration. You know what I mean? So I would agree with that. Just being like curious around, oh, well, like what if I did this a little bit differently? Or, hey, this kind of looks like this, but if I move the seat to here and then I like change my grip here, how could that, would I be stronger in that position? Like those sorts of things, I think, and kind of exactly what you said, like just starting to explore more.
Yeah, I don't think that at that point of my journey that I was doing any of that. Like I was really kind of going through the motions, because like you exactly said, I fully agree. Like whatever stage I was at, intermediate, crawling into advanced or whatever, like my physique was fine. My physique looked pretty good. I was the jacked guy, And so for me, I was like kind of just chugging along at homeostasis. And what was I doing at that time? I was actually training during my lunch breaks at work. And because I was new to the corporate world, I only had an hour for lunch. It would be like zip to the gym 5 minutes away, crush one muscle group. I think I was doing 9 sets per muscle group for the most part. And then get back to don't sweat, of course, you can't sweat. Then get back to work, change back into the work clothes, be behind my desk like an hour or 75 minutes later or whatever. So I was just, fitting training in a way that worked with my life so that I could kind of focus on other things. And maybe that also speaks to the fact that it's how much of a priority it is in your life. Like it's really hard to go from intermediate to advanced if like hanging out with your friends and being social is more important to you than getting all them gains, because we all know the last 2% is the hardest 2% to get, right? So that's all very interesting and good points as well. I certainly agree on the mental aspect, and I think that probably is the driver that's pushing all of the inquisitive nature that you need to have to move to that next stage.
Yeah, one of the notes that I had down that you kind of just hit on was like training is a consistent priority in your life for years, like multiple of years. Like people will get into training because of like a girlfriend broke up with them or a boyfriend broke up with them, right? And it's like, I'm going to show you by, getting in shape sort of thing. But like you can't use that as motivation like 4 years later, or unless you're like a fucking psychopath, you know what I mean? So it's those sorts of things. And then as you, like it's very, very common in college, right? You get into training because you think, girls or guys are going to like you for it or whatever. And then you realize it's really just other dudes on the internet that like you because you have a physique. But then you go through these like phases of life where then, exercise becomes less important sort of thing. And like more socializing after work, happy hours, getting together with other couples sorts of things. And if the gym always becomes, or training becomes a lower priority than those sorts of things, it's like those types of decisions of where you kind of get stuck in that like intermediate from like let's call it like a whole intermediate, or because it is a little bit of, it's subjective, right? But one thing that I found for myself is like that desire to train was always like more important than like if they're like, oh, we're going to happy hour. I'm like, okay, guys, have fun. I'm going to go to the gym and lift weights. Like that was always a higher desire than it. And for me personally, it was easier because post college, I got into a group of friends who we always just lifted weights together. So I got the best of both worlds, the social aspect of hanging out with my friends, and we were always lifting weights. So it, kind of killed two birds with one stone. But then it was like after that group of friends had like moved away and that sort of thing, like the training was still the desire. I didn't go find like new friends to go do something else with. It was just like, I'm going to always go to the gym. Like that desire's been high for 20, damn near 20 years now.
Well, that's probably also speaks to your introverted nature where you're like, oh, if I can avoid a happy hour with coworkers that I can go lift, like obviously I'm going to choose that.
That could be a part of it as well.
Just to shift gears, and then I want to get back to training in a second, but I think that nutrition is a super big piece of this as well, or like kind of what you're putting in your body. And that was a huge piece for me in that first, maybe that era of time I was talking about, where I wasn't focusing on nutrition. So I was kind of treading water in the gym and just going through the motions because I wasn't making progress. But was that lack of progress because my training was bad, or was it just that I wasn't hitting all of the bases that I needed to for nutrition? Again, going back to priorities, because I was fitting that training session in at lunch so that I could finish work and go home and either sit on the couch and get blazed with my roommates, or if it's a weekend or a Thursday, Friday, probably going to the bar and getting drunk. So there's all of these things that are happening. They're kind of like an extension of college that weren't super conducive to my growth overall. And I actually was in, so I have this side chat that I'm in with Abel and Dave, and I sent them a picture of myself in a picture that I used to love from 2008 or 2009, where Anders and I are at a football game and sun's hitting me just right and my arms up in the air and I'm like, yeah, number one, I'm probably having beers, shirts off. And I think I look so jacked. And so I sent this picture to Dave and I was like, look, 2009. And he goes, oh my God, you're so much bigger now. And I was like, oh, well, that was like, that was my jacked pick, and then it kind of reminded me of exactly what I was talking about, that I really wasn't optimizing there. Like even in that picture, I was having beers on a Saturday, at a football game at UCLA. So it's crazy what can happen, how at that point I was 25 or 26, 27, whatever it was. So I should have been in a better position 12 years into training to optimize my testosterone being better, this, blah, 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 like all these factors playing into it. And yet here I am at basically almost 40 years old. And because I'm a little more optimized with stuff and not doing things to derail my progress, that I'm seeing potentially a better physique.
I think in what you said there was at the end it was the kicker, not doing things that will like not derail, but like inhibit the progress that you make from those same gym actions. So it's like, it comes back to the classic example, like nutrition and lifestyle is huge. I've literally built a company on it. If you take exactly what you're doing in the gym and you keep that the same and then modify the other 23 hours in a day, right, you get better returns on the same investment inside the gym. And I think that was a fantastic note there.
I think on the same lines of nutrition is kind of the idea of fatigue management, and deloads can kind of go in there as well into that pot. So even though I was basically training on a bro split and I was, training 5 days a week for 45 minutes, but I was pushing to failure. I was going super hard and I was drinking on the weekends. I never took deloads. Like I just didn't know about it. I didn't know it was necessary. The Max OT program had a week off, an active recovery week every 8 to 10 weeks. It was like, you just take a week off from the gym and don't train. I almost never did that. Because it was part of my routine. It was just consistency. It was what I did. And obviously consistency is huge, in getting from level to level. But for me, that consistency, was an excessive level to the point that it definitely inhibited my results. And the saying that always is put out there about deloads is if you don't take them proactively, then they're going to happen for you. Life's going to deload for you. And this is literally what would happen to me. I would get sick, be forced to take 5 days off, or I would injure my shoulder doing an overhead press to failure and I would have to take a week off, or like hurt my back squatting, whatever it was, any number of things. Every 8 to 12 weeks, something would happen. But the bad part about letting those things deload for you, aside from the obvious and that you're injured and that sucks, is that your body's not actually repairing like your fatigue. It's trying to repair your injury. So it's not really actually helping you facilitate recovery to progress toward your goals. So I think, with everything we know now, thanks to science, about how even a week off, 5 weeks later, over the course of time, like you could take 3 weeks off every 6 weeks, according to that one study. And over the end of the 6-week training period, you're going to be right back to where you were. It almost is just naive to think that you could or should train without the use of deloads or active recovery phases at some level.
Yeah, the thing that you said there that I really liked is even like in high school, right, or in college, right, I trained 4 or 5 days per week, but it was just because that's what I thought you did. Oh, because like that's all you need to do. You just need 5 days, and you're like, okay, cool. But it wasn't because that I knew that those other 2 days were because that I was repairing, and that's how you manage fatigue and stuff. And even, this was a conversation you and I had in, 2011, 2012, no, probably 2012, when you were like, hey, are you guys training on Sundays too? And I was like, yeah, fuck yeah, we are, dude. And you were like, no, you cannot train 7 days per week and just, grind yourself into the ground. I literally had no idea. I thought like the more work I do, the better I get, which to a point, right, makes sense, but only if you're recovering, and able to do that. And it was one of those things where I would get into like, oh, well, my PRs aren't coming. That means I'm not working hard enough. And it very well was like I was literally working too hard and never recovering. And that's one of those things that, I can't say in this day and age because I'm just super out of the space, but that was one thing that getting caught into CrossFit was very like bad at. It's like the more is better, and then your active recovery is just not as intense as your normal days, but they're still training sort of thing. It's just like the team no days off thing, and not understanding how absolutely silly that actually is in the grand scheme of achieving your goals.
Yeah, fatigue masking fitness. It is a little bit ambiguous and gray when you have a neural, like skill-based sport like CrossFit. Yes, you still need days off and stuff, but it is tough. And I understand, obviously, because I had the same experience you did, but like I get that neurotic mindset of, I'm missing an opportunity to get better at something type thing. So yeah, if we shift back into like some training stuff here, there's the idea of training volume and training effort and how these are forever intertwined with each other. As we always talk on the podcast about how there's one extreme where you can do very little volume, but you got to take every set to the house or even beyond. And then on the other extreme, you can do shit tons of volume, but maybe you got to keep 6, 7 RIR. As we're now seeing, you can even make progress like that. Didn't know that 15 years ago. But we always know that there needs to be some sort of balance between those two. And I really, really think that the epitome, the pinnacle of being able to call yourself advanced is to get closer and closer to like what is the asymptote graph of you possibly achieving that perfect balance for yourself. And understanding that balance will shift over time, that it's never cemented in stone that I'm always going to be training with this volume and this effort, but understanding, that there probably is a side of that spectrum that is better for you than another side. And that's obviously a combination of psychological and physiological factors. But, when you compare my journey from before that I keep referencing, I didn't have that understanding. I just kept looking to templated programs to be like, oh, well, that's the program that's going to get me over this hump and like keep me progressing, because this person's getting great results off of it. And then this time around now, 10, 12 years later, as I got reintroduced back into hypertrophy training exclusively in 2017 or so, the whole last 5 years has been an exploration in this for me. And it's meandered on a very consistent course from 2017 where volume was king, and that was my experiment because that's what the research said, that I was doing high volumes, I was staying shy of failure and things like that, to where I am now, where I do a bit of a mix of them, and it depends on the stage of the training that I'm doing, and certain movements can be trained with more volume than others. And it all kind of circles back to that big overriding precedent that you mentioned in the beginning of it being more mental, of understanding and learning and exploring and trying to apply, and essentially being like the CEO of your own body, a scientist for your own experiments, and you moving closer and closer to the type of training that allows you to continue progressing, and not just doing a program that's out there and being stuck in this idea of like, well, RP is the way or whatever, because I follow Dr. Mike, and like that's what works for a lot of people. And it absolutely certainly does. It may work for you as well. And that's great, because then you don't have to go exploring for something else. But if you put in 6 months or 8 months or a year into training a certain way and you find that it isn't working for you, then there are different routes you can go. And there are 2 routes you could take, right? You could either change things dramatically and be like, well, fuck high volume, I'm going to high effort, low volume. But what I would suggest is to maybe do that gradually, because you obviously were gravitated to a certain training style. So instead of completely changing course and immediately dropping to something completely different, where honestly, you're probably going to start doubting things because you're so ingrained in believing that this other way is the way to go. If you quickly change course and do a different way, you might do a few weeks of it and be like, nope, not enough volume. I know it's not enough. Whereas if you ended up there over the course of 6 months or a year, where you gradually decreased volume and gradually increased effort, maybe your sweet spot isn't all the way where you would have gone. Maybe it's not at the bottom of the volume train, but maybe it's somewhere more in the middle, which is honestly probably where most people are going to lie anyways.
I mean, you really, really summed it up really well there. It's like most people are going to probably lie somewhere in the middle, and we're going to have our own preferences that will lead us one way or another. And one thing that I really wish I could remember the podcast I was listening to on it, but it was like they were talking about one of the studies on like volume and intensity sort of thing. And I really wish I could remember it so I could give the person credit that said it, but they're like, research studies are going to report population like means. If you look at the plotted information of each of those individuals, you are going to have the outlier who got a credible response to like 9 sets over the mean of what they recommended for everyone. And then there's going to be someone else who is the complete antithesis of that. So like, yes, it's a great spot to use these studies and stuff to begin your own explorations, but like you could very well find yourself an anomaly in some of these things, and you never know until you start exploring it yourself. And that is like being like open enough to accept that and start exploring it is some of those things that are going to push you into that advanced territory instead of just running, off the shelf programs. And because at any level, right, when Bryan writes a program, when I write a program, we have to make assumptions, and we can do the best we can, but there's always going to be an assumption in there. And you may very well find yourself that assumption does not work for you the best in that certain context. And then having the wherewithal and knowing the knowledge of, hey, I'm going to modify this like this because that will better suit me. Like that's where you really start pushing into that advanced territory.
Yeah, I think individualization is probably the key there. Is just that training becomes less generalized and more specific to you. And with that comes this idea of progression. And shit, if we know as an advanced person that I said in the beginning, 5 to 10 pounds a year might be like what you end up adding to a lift potentially. or nothing. I mean, you maybe just improve form and your weights don't go up, which is kind of where I've been for a decent amount of time now.
And your shoulders don't hurt anymore.
Right,
And
exactly.
you're like, yeah, I don't care if I never bench 15-pound dumbbells again. If my shoulders feel good, I don't give a fuck.
That's the exact example I always use. It's like I have this picture in my head of me incline pressing the 120s for 8 when I was college, post-college, something like that. But I wish I had video of it, because there's like no way that I was doing like dumbbells to my chest. There's no way that I wasn't like leaning to one side on the final rep to like help get leverage. And like, of course, I always ended up injuring my shoulder. So, but when we talk about progression, so figuring out the best way to progress for you is important too, because man, I love the philosophical approach to progressive overload. Like, I think it makes so much sense when you look at like the chicken and the egg thing, but I think there's problems with it too, in implementation. So the philosophical approach to progressive overload essentially says that you shouldn't add weight to the bar. You should just wait to see that you got stronger, which essentially means you wait until the weight you're using is too easy. And then that's your sign to be like, oh, well, shit, the weight's too light now. I have to add weight, or else the weight's going to be too light and I'm not going to continue making gains, right? The proactive approach is the opposite. It's like, if I don't add weight, then I'm not going to adapt, and therefore I won't progress. And in reality, it's probably somewhere in the middle, like it always is. I really tried super hard for the philosophical approach, and I would wait, weeks, and just maybe I didn't wait weeks, but I felt like weeks. But like I a couple sessions, and I would just kind of do the same reps, and it didn't really feel easier, and that's when I had to personally shift away from that idea of just waiting for progression to come and then noticing it and adding weight. And that's where I started using a couple different techniques. One being microloading, and huge fan of microloading. So they make these micro plates now, fractional plates is what they're called. You can buy them anywhere you can get a set for like $30, and you get a pair of 1 pound plates, 3/4 pound, half pound, and 1/4 pound plates. And so this allows you to progress at a super slow rate. Something like under 1% of the total you're lifting is difficult for your body to detect on an acute basis. So if you're lifting 100 pounds, if you add less than 1 pound to the bar, you could theoretically do that each week for a high number of weeks before you actually catch up with that adaptation. So I'm a huge fan of that. I think that most people, as they go into the advanced stage, would be benefited by using that, because it gives you a small win. And psychologically, one of the biggest pieces of training is being able to come out of a session and feeling like you didn't waste time, because you work hard. And if you just went in every week and did the exact same thing, it would be really easy to get stuck in that monotony. So microloading is one way that you can at least add something each session. And then, as I have discussed a lot over prior episodes, so I'm not going to harp on it, but I like to use the progression method of increasing the stimulus, where lengthened movements and short overload movements are progressed slightly differently. Lengthened overload movements are usually progressed one rep closer to failure each week, where short overload movements will progress to failure over a course of 1 or 2 weeks, and then beyond failure with a series of partial reps and reverse drop sets and things like that. So similarly to microloading or fractional loading, my current approach allows me to achieve small wins each day. And that can be something as small as I added 2 more partials to my leg extension and I didn't lose a ton of range of motion. Or maybe I did even lose some range of motion, but I still did more work than I did the prior week. So small wins are key to being advanced, and whatever methods allow you to achieve those little small victories session to session, I think would be a huge piece of achieving long-term success and staying consistent with your training.
I personally really like the microloading. And the reason being, it's the same thing. Like I'm stacking those small wins, which when you've been training this long, like the wins don't really just come around very often. So if you can just, you know, add up a couple like small ones, over the weeks, like it feels good to get some wins. And then the one thing I wanted to just agree with you on with the theoretical standpoint of or approach to the um, progressive overload is it sounds really corny, but there's that quote that's like it doesn't get any easier, it doesn't feel any easier, you just get stronger. And that's really kind of how it feels. Like there's been multiple times where I'm like, fuck, dude, these 85s feel really heavy today. But then I'll get the 90s or the 95s for the same amount of reps as I did on the 85s. So like if I just used that feeling, right? It's a subjective perception. I may have never put another 10 pounds on, but I could still complete just as many reps with the 10 pounds on because it's hard to perceive subjectively, right? Which is what our perceptions really are, differences within small degrees. But even though those small degrees of that work, like that adds up, that is where you get the progressive overload from.
Yeah. I will say one of the things we do know from science is that you don't need to add weight to the bar or do progressive overload to still stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which I think is interesting because I don't know that I necessarily would have thought that or believed that 12 years ago. I still kind of struggle with like the theoretical like idea behind it, but like apparently you still stimulate muscle protein synthesis for a number of weeks of using the same weight for the same reps before your body would kind of like be like, oh, okay, this, I don't need to adapt to this, type thing. Mm-hmm. So I think that's interesting for what it's worth. And I think that that's important for somebody as we go through the stages of being advanced to understand that like, that's okay too. And you're actually better at that than I am. Like, I know you've talked about how you will keep a same weight for a number of weeks in a row before going up. And I tend to always want to feel like I'm getting a small victory of some sort,
Yeah. Yep.
So I think execution is an interesting one. And I put exercise execution and exercise selection later down on my list of importance here. And I even struggle with the order, but I think that execution is probably like a little bit more important in the movement to advanced, because if you don't have your execution dialed in, like that's almost something I would expect of you as an intermediate would be to kind of beginning to dial in that execution piece. And so execution has two components to it. It has like whether you're optimally executing the movement for the muscle group that you want to stimulate, but I think a very underrated piece of execution is consistency in rep execution. Does your first rep look like your last rep? Except obviously the last rep being slower, but like, are you able to maintain the exact same movement pattern, whether the weight is light in the beginning or the weight is hard in the end? And these are things that when I look at that prior version of myself, post-college, that isn't the case. My movement did not look the same from the first rep to the last rep. And I would be compensating. I would be increasing rep speed potentially on the eccentric. I would be potentially shorting range of motion at the lengthened position because I was getting tired and I wanted to beat the logbook type thing, which actually gives me a tangent idea that maybe the idea of trying to beat the logbook all the time can be part of the problem in the intermediate stage, in that, getting that consistency in exercise execution should be a staple before you worry about beating the logbook. And then if you beat the logbook, it's because you did it in the exact same manner that you did prior. So that would be certainly a piece as well. But what do you think about the execution piece?
I think it's huge. And one thing where I think the landscape of like technology in this day and age can be a little bit better, but is like it's very easy to record yourself, especially when you're like, hey, I'm going to post these lifting videos of myself on Instagram because that's going to make girls like me or whatever. And then you watch it and you're like, yeah, I'm not going to fucking post that because I look like shit performing that. Whereas like back then for us, like they're like the phones, like I was like 21 years old when the first iPhone came out. You know what I mean? Like I had already been years of lifting, never saw what my form looked like or anything. So I think that can really help because it's again, that's subjective perception of, I feel like it looks like this. But when you watch a video, it's like, nah, dog, it looks like this. And you're like, yeah, those 100.
Like my deadlifts in the CrossFit days.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, no, that doesn't look like how I thought it felt when I performed it. So it gives you a little bit more like tangible feedback to be like, okay, that weight's probably too heavy. My range of motion sucks. I should probably, improve this if I want to post it on the internet.
Yeah. Yeah. I would never have posted any of my videos of benching 120-pound dumbbells ever. So then we kind of have exercise selection. And so I think it's easy to look at exercise selection as like one of these just terms that's being thrown around now. And it's very much associated a lot of times, for at least for us, with some of the N1 stuff and doing these like super acute, like lat focused or whatever type movements. But I would actually think that moving from intermediate to advanced, the selection is less about trying to target like one specific area of your muscle. And it should more be about you now are determining and know, maybe not even, you have determined that there are certain exercises that fit your body and there are certain exercises that don't. And if you have an inability to understand at this point that hypertrophy really can occur through a variety of different exercise selections, then you probably have no business even being advanced. Like you have to find exercises that keep you in the game. Like if I would have continued barbell bench pressing as my primary chest exercise, man, I stopped doing that like literally in 2006. Like before all these stories about my post-college experience, I stopped barbell benching. That was just not something that was good for me. And I knew that very quickly. So I think being able to dial in the movements that feel good for you and not trying to do a movement because somebody on the internet says that it's important for you to do this movement, that's a critical step in making that leap to the next level.
Again, like I said, everything that comes with those assumptions, right? You see, people are still making these, YouTube videos, and there's these articles like, this is the best mass builder for triceps and stuff like that. But if it hurts your fucking triceps and it hurts your shoulders, like, you're not building fuck all. You're just, inching closer to when one of those structures is going to give, and then you're really not going to be building fuck all. So I think it all comes back to like, there are things that can be at a population level more, appropriate for a larger group of people, but you could very well be on the complete opposite end of that spectrum. And that's where that individualization comes in.
Yeah. The whole thing, I think the overriding presiding message of this entire like journey from intermediate to advanced is that aspect, and then the individualization piece, and then also the exploration, the education, the learning of yourself, and the understanding of the way psychology plays into it. Because, man, I didn't even think much about the psychology at all for so many years. Like it was always, fuck the psychology, whatever is optimal, like optimal, whatever I knew to be optimal back then, like give me that shit. Like, oh, that's the templated program that worked for that person. I don't even care if I don't enjoy doing it. I'm going to do that because it worked for them type thing. And that kind of narrow-minded thinking is going to keep you in intermediate stage, and then being able to kind of open up and understand that there's an inevitable coordination between psychology and physiology, and that they're never going to be able to be separated, that will help propel your journey into that advanced stage.
Agreed. Yeah. The exercise, the selection thing, it's still newer for me, but I am finding just explosion levels of like awareness and stuff from it, because it allows you to increase the capability of what you can of the stimulus you can provide with the equipment that you have, and knowing like, hey, I'm looking to do this. That instead of saying, let me back up a little bit. So many people with intermediate, right? Like, I'm training back. I know that barbell row is back, lat pull down is back, and like dumbbell, one arm row is back, right? I mean, that's where I existed for years. And then let's say I go to a gym and there's like no lat pull down. I'm like, oh, I can't train back because they don't have this. But now knowing that like, if I want to train this structure, this is the movement pattern that I need to recreate. what options do I have available to me to recreate that movement pattern? I mean, that's exactly what I've been doing. Like where I am here in Virginia, like this gym is tiny. There is not a lot of equipment, but they have one cable stack, right? And what you guys maybe see on my Instagram is like, I get creative as fuck. I know what I'm looking to recreate. I'll pull things around. I'll leverage this like 2x6 that's in there to give me leverage to get myself further enough away from the cable stack. And I'm able to recreate a lot of things. I'm getting a lot of weird looks in the gym, but like I'm making gains over here. These motherfuckers are still doing the same thing day in and day out, not going anywhere. So it's really just like when you know what you're looking for. But again, that comes back to that's not physical whatsoever. That's all mental and looking at things from a different standpoint because I understand this is the movement pattern that I want to recreate to target these structures.
Yep. And it just helps so much with longevity. Like when we talk about, the most important pieces of how our bodies feel training this way in the last 6 months, year or so since we did the N1 stuff, it really is just that I'm almost 40 and my body feels better than it did in my late 20s. So, yeah, I mean, there's something to it. And I think that I've learned, as I should, to make that jump into advanced. Like, obviously I'm advanced. I'm sitting here talking on a podcast about it, but I would have never gotten to where I am had it not been for those failures or the difficulties, the challenges to go from intermediate to advanced in the past. And so I just encourage people to constantly be exploring and, looking to figure out what it is that is best for you and not what is best for people around you that might be influencing your thought patterns.
Yeah. So, I mean, if I were to wrap it up, it's the exploration, right? Looking at training from, I mean, obviously it's this incredibly encompassing physical endeavor, but that advanced stage, you're approaching things much more mentally first to make sure that you're checking your boxes. And I have like two examples that I thought of here. Well, I thought of one, shout out Nick Deacon, who helped me with another one. It was a conversation I was having with him. But take your classic kettlebell swing, right? Look at your Instagram influencer or someone like that, right? Who might be in incredibly good shape, right? Performing a kettlebell swing. They're doing like a squat with like a shoulder raise type thing. You know what I mean? But if you take anyone who's like actually been coached through, I can't remember if it was like you or Anders or whoever taught me back in the day, but like the kettlebell swing for like, power output or whatever, like it is a force development type thing. You don't create the force by squatting down, right? It's a hip extension movement. And like when you know that and then you watch people do it and you're like, oh, I don't know fucking clue what they're doing. Because they don't understand like it's the approach of the exercise. And it's kind of that thing of like someone's like, watching someone squat who just thinks that, oh, I go down and I come back up and my legs grow type of thing. Yes, but there's like, I mean, that's the beginning of the sentence, not the end of the sentence type of thing. So that's the first one. And then the example that my friend Nick gave me was like, if you see people like deadlifting, right? You see your average gym bro deadlifting and they're like, oh, was my back flat or was my back, rounded? And that's like the definition of like a good or back, deadlift.
Bad deadlift.
And you're going into it like, okay, keep my back flat. Whereas like when I go into deadlift, right, I'm thinking, okay, I'm taking this like large belly breath. I'm bracing 365 degrees of outward facing pressure, right, to protect my core. The distribution of the pressure between my forefoot, my heel, whether it's outside in, right? I'm thinking about that. Preloading tension in my hamstrings and glutes and pulling the slack out of the bar. So, I mean, there is a process. And I mean, I am not by any means like an incredible deadlifter. You get into some of the people like your powerlifters, their setup probably has like another 10 steps. But it's like that sort of level of thinking. It's not just, is my back straight or flat? There's so much more that goes into it. And at the end of the day, like it translates into a physical representation of, a weight moving, but that is a purely mental setup and understanding like your biomechanics and the different things that you can do that will drastically improve the performance. And then ultimately downstream, the tension you're able to create, the force you're able to produce, which translates to gains, So it's again, that's kind of the big thing from my standpoint, right? At least is like how you approach things mentally is dramatically different as an advanced trainee as opposed to intermediate.
Yeah, that was a great analogy that compares kind of the setup of the deadlift to all of these other factors that separate somebody that's intermediate from advanced. So that was great. And then I also think, to even cap that off, as far as whether your back is flat or rounded, that shit without anyone having to tell you.
Yeah, you should. You should. Yeah.
If you're advanced, you know what I mean? Yeah. So anyway, that's all I got. I think that was solid.
Same. Cool. As always, guys, thank you for listening to Eat, Train, Prosper. Bryan and I will talk to you next week.